community. We're working on the Atlantic Council on shaping a better world post-COVID-19 with our friends and allies, not just the same world. These challenges require innovation, creative problem solving, and most importantly, allies and partners. And our friends in Sweden have all three of these in spades. So I got a little nervous this morning. I couldn't find my lapel pin, which was my Order of the Polar Star from the Swedish King, Madam Minister. I am so proud of it. So I'm going to hold the one that I'm only really allowed to wear with white tie. But I'm so proud of this because of our long-standing relationship from Sweden, the importance with which we hold the country, and the importance with which the Atlantic holds the bilateral relationship. At the Atlantic Council, we're innovating as we respond to the global implications of this crisis. We're developing new formats, new methods. In many respects, we feel our global community is more tightly knit than it ever has been before through these digital efforts. We've been convening on questions such as data privacy, national and personal security, regional instability, and rising authoritarianism, all of which confront the transatlantic community. Our friends in Stockholm have been similarly creative in their work, and we're proud to be welcoming Minister Linde as part of her digital bilateral visit to Washington, D.C., and she'll tell us more about that in a moment. Rather than postponing her planned visit here because of the virus, she and her team organized an impressive digital program, virtual program, including a meeting yesterday with Secretary Pompeo, and we look forward to hearing about that. Because even as we're physically distant as a community, I actually don't think it's social distance. I think we can maintain social closeness even as we have physical distance. This is just the latest in a list of examples of Sweden's nimble foreign policy, which includes the first explicitly feminist foreign policy and the Drive for Democracy program. These initiatives permeate the work of the Swedish Foreign Service, articulating publicly and continuously the priorities of the government for global gender equality at all levels and a more open, more free, more democratic world. The Atlantic Council has partnered with the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs for many years. Our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works closely with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs on building a strategic partnership for a global future, addressing a wide array of common security and foreign policy challenges and opportunities. Advancing the democratic world in the face of an authoritarian surge is a top priority of our partnership, which is informed throughout by strategy, foresight, and strategies. And our Eurasia Center also works closely with the MFA on issues concerning Ukraine and on their Ukraine initiative. The MFA also works closely with the Council's Future Europe Initiative office in Stockholm, led by the indomitable Anna Wieslander. We're very proud of Anna's directorship of our office in Sweden and our work in the region. It participates in public debates, provides analysis and publications, and arranges workshops, seminars, and conferences that bring together policymakers and a diverse group of stakeholders in order to forge solutions to address regional security challenges and the heart of it all, the transatlantic relationship and our bilateral relationship. Minister Linde has served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs since September of last year, previously holding positions as Minister for the EU Affairs and Trade and Minister for Foreign Trade with responsibility for Nordic affairs. Minister Linde, we are thrilled to welcome you here today virtually. We hope to see you soon physically here as well. As you and Sweden respond to coronavirus, the implications for regional security, and the way forward for the transatlantic relationship, we hope to hear all these issues. I now hand the floor over to another indomitable person, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, a senior fellow with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and a longtime board member of the Atlantic Council. She was also Under Secretary of State for Global Affairs. Look forward to your conversation, Paula, with Minister Linde. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Fred, and welcome to you, Minister Linde. We're going to begin the interview in just a minute. I do want to just state up front that this event is organized by the Atlantic Council's Future Europe Initiative and with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I thought it's also important to mention for all our attendees that we're going to conduct the interview, and we will have a portion of time towards the end of the interview to field Q&A. So please do share your questions via the Q&A box on Zoom. For those who are live streaming or watching it through social media, what you can do, you can reply to the live streaming basically on the various platforms which are afforded to you. So with that, let's get underway. And again, welcome, Minister Linde. I really want to begin, if we can, with the whole situation of the pandemic and COVID-19, because Sweden's response to COVID-19 has really received quite a bit of attention, at least here in the United States, I'd say. And so you've chosen a path that differs from others, from some of your neighbors in the transatlantic community. So please tell us what the strategy is. We would be very interested in hearing your perspective, and welcome again to you.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you to the Atlantic Council. I'm very honored to be here. It's great to start today with my virtual visit in Washington with this breakfast meeting. And when it comes to the Swedish strategy, I have understood that there is quite an interest in the United States. I have been interviewed both by the Fox Business News and CNN and so on. And what I have to say is that the goals from the Swedish government in this is very much the same as most other countries, is to hinder the spread of the virus, is to try not to get too many deceased, is to get the healthcare system to cope with the pressure, but it's also to mitigate the economic consequences for businesses and for workers. And the way we conduct that might be a little different from other countries, mainly because we don't believe in lockdown, and for example, and that is for several reasons. The first, I would say that we have a mix between clearly advice and recommendations and legally binding measures. So to start with, I mean, legally binding measures, we have no groups larger than 50 persons. It's forbidden to visit elderly homes since a month ago, and so on. There is also, when it comes to restaurants and bars and clubs are open, but it's not allowed to stand in the bar. And in the restaurant, you have to keep your social distance. And the social distancing is the most important thing in our strategy. And we think that that is something that is vital for not spreading the virus. We have also seen that the recommendations that the government and our authority is given to the people is followed to a great extent. If it were not to be followed, the government is in no way reluctant to start using legally binding measures also in other areas. The reason for why we don't believe in lockdown are both, of course, we think it's good not to close down every shop and restaurant and so forth or workplace for economical reason, but it's also we believe that it's good for the public health that people are outdoors. We want people to go walks, to go jogging, to go in outdoor gyms, as long as they keep the social distance. We have not locked down our school until the second grade, I mean, from the nursery until they are roughly 15 years old, because our public agency of health has not seen that there is a lot of spreading among kids or youth. And in Sweden, about 80% of the families, both parents work. So in the government, when we discussed this and we got the information that there were not such a spread between children and youth, the economical impact of closing the school would be severe. And also so many people who do work in the healthcare sector, in the elderly sector, all kind of job that is critical, they would have to be home and take care of children instead. And we didn't think that that was a proportionality in the measures that we should take. Finally, why do we believe that recommendation is working? Well, I would say that that's our tradition and culture. For more than 400 years, we have had very small ministries, very big public authorities. People tend to see recommendation from authorities as something that should be followed. We have, for example, a vaccination program that's not legally binding. 97% of all families is vaccinating their kids voluntarily. I think it's because there is very low grade of corruption. There is a big trust between authorities, politicians, and people in all directions. And that is why we feel we can do this not with only legally binding measures, but also with recommendations.
Thank you so much for that response, a very full response, and it's appreciated that we're hearing it directly from you, because there has been a great interest, at least on this side of the Atlantic, and so thank you for that. Now, during your virtual visit to the U.S., you've mentioned that you've had a chance to talk to counterparts. I'm sure also an important part of this discussion is the way forward post-coronavirus. And so on that note, how can we work together across the Atlantic to get societies and basically our economies going forward? That's been a big issue here just domestically in the US, the balance of how you deal with the staying at home, and then also combining and closing down different businesses, and how you deal with economies and getting these businesses going forward. So for you, how can we look at this from a transatlantic context? What's your advice? What are you thinking about?
Well, I have no advice, but I think that the international cooperation to both fight the pandemic, but also to get us back on track afterwards is very important. When it comes to fighting the pandemic, we believe that international cooperation, for example, with development cooperation, trying to help vulnerable countries to get better system of their healthcare system, to redirect our development aid towards building more sustainable health system, because if there is the second wave, it comes more to developing countries, then it can bounce back again. So it's important that we help them, and that's why also we are quite not happy, but we think that the WHO is doing an important job now. So we think it's not the time right now for accountability, but for letting them do their work in this pandemic. The second thing I would say is that we need to get the trade back on track. And also inside the European Union, but also, of course, across the Atlantic, there has been too many export restrictions that has hampered the trade severely. And this should not be the time for protectionism and isolationism, because it will be a big economic break if we do that. For example, when if you have a Swedish company like Getinge, who is a world delivery of ventilators, they need to get components from other countries to be able to do their ventilators and then be able to export them to all of those countries in need. But now there is restrictions in several countries, meaning that they are hampered when they are going to make their ventilators. So that is a counterproductive way of dealing with this. The global value chains is really highlighted, and the vulnerability of the global value chains are highlighted in this way, in a negative way, I would say. So it's imperative for all nations to those flow of materials is kept open, and that would be the first thing I would say. And also inside the European Union, we need to do that. It's also important that we together go against the tendencies of using the pandemic for authoritarian governments and regimes to hinder democracy, rule of law, freedom for journalism, all of this that we have seen in several countries, including quite a lot of disinformation. Sweden has also seen that rather clearly from, of course, from some of the other big countries who wants to give picture of a fragmented Europe, of a government that is not taking responsibility, because it's in their geopolitical interest that after the pandemic, those regimes seem stronger. For example, being able to say that it's more easy for an authoritarian government to solve those issues than for a democratic government. And I think that this is something we could cooperate with between Europe and the United States as soon as possible, and especially directly after the worst part of the pandemic is over.
Thank you for that. Sweden's immediate neighborhood, of course, is the Baltic Sea region. And clearly that is very much at the heart of your own foreign and security policy. And let me ask you in that regard, what are the challenges that you see in your region that are taking place now, that are occurring now during this crisis period, and then also that you expect will continue in the future?
Well, of course, in our neighborhood, Russia is a constant priority and in our security policy. And we can never accept that you divided the world into a sphere of influence. So it's very important that we stay on message regarding Russia's violation of international law in Ukraine, Georgia. It's clear that Russia believes that it's only a matter of time before EU and other Western partners will relax their attitude towards sanctions, for example. But we need to stay focused and repeat again and again that violation of international law comes at a cost. And the strategic patient here is of essence. I want to underscore that our differences here with Russia are with the Kremlin, not with the Russian people. I believe that the two-track policy that Sweden has towards Russia is important. I mean, one policy that we should keep the sanction, we should insist on the European security order and be very strong on being clear on this message to Russia. On the other hand, to continue to have people-to-people contacts, to have trade, to have cooperation in when it comes to the environment, search and rescue, or whatever. this is especially important for us, I would say, because we are now a member of the Troika of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And from the 1st of January, we will become the president, or it's named chair in office. And we will have the European Security Order as a central part of our work, and here the US engagement in the Nordic, in the northern region or Northern Europe is very, very important. And I really hope that the US will continue to see this as a priority. Also on defense side, we have now a bilateral defense agreement between United States and Sweden, for example, and I hope that we will soon be able to resume, for example, joint defense exercises, and that we can continue to see US be very active in the OSCE region. I talked a lot with Secretary Pompeo about this. And also a thing that unfortunately we have different views with the American administration, and that is something called the Open Skies Treaty, which the United States has said it might withdraw from this treaty. For us, this is very important. We have invested a lot in special open sky planes, and I know that there are difficulties with this treaty, but for us, this is also a priority.
Minister, I want to, in a moment, ask you about your visit with Secretary Pompeo, but let me continue on about the Baltic region, and then in particular, the fact that the High North, Sweden, your neighbors, there has been a real focus on the Arctic and what's happening in the Arctic. And as we were talking about some of the challenges, just say a word about what you might be witnessing during this time. I know Russia has built a base. There have been other developments that continue to take place during this period. Would you say a word about the Arctic? Because also that's something that the Atlantic Council and certainly the Scowcroft Center has really placed as a priority, working with all the members of the Nordic and the High North community.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. And I have to start by saying that in the Arctic Council and in the Barents Council, the Russians are very constructive. We have a very good cooperation that we evaluate very much. We would like to see the Arctic area as a low tension area. We wanted to deal a lot with climate change, because you cannot talk about Arctic if you don't talk about climate change, because that is what is changing both the security policy implications, but also the nature, and also the possibility for people in the Arctic, including the indigenous people, to be able to live and thrive in the area as such. So those are what we work with in the Arctic cooperation. We will now present from the government communication to the Parliament about our Arctic policy, and those are the issues that we will concentrate on. We see a very strong growing security policy interest in the Arctic area. And it's of course because it will be much easier when the ice is melting, that you could use those ways that are open, that has been closed before. That's also possibilities for trade, for example, trade routes. But we have to keep our eyes open for what's going on. And I don't want to see a Wild West behavior, that people don't believe that international law of the sea, for example, should not be applied in the Arctic area, because it is. That is very, very important, that there will be law and order and low tension continuously in the Arctic area.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Now, tell us, we are very interested. Tell us about your visit with Secretary Pompeo. You already mentioned one of the topics that came up. What did you discuss? I'd like to ask especially, did North Korea come into the discussion? Sweden has played an important role working with us on policies towards North Korea. We'd be very interested in hearing what were some of the key topics of your exchange.
Yes, well, let me start with the Korean Peninsula issue. And of course, we have a very close cooperation there. The issue is, of course, to get peace and total denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And we had, and I would say it was quite successful meeting in Stockholm in October, where the delegation from United States and North Korea were actually negotiating longer than what was foreseen. Unfortunately, afterwards, maybe it was it went maybe a little bit too well, because afterwards we got the embassy in Stockholm said that they were not very happy with the discussions. But we don't see the doors are closed. Our special envoy, Mr. Kent Hasted, he has an invitation to come to North Korea after the pandemic is over. And we are still there. We haven't closed our embassy. We are the guardian power for United States, but also for other countries. The big issue now that everybody is thinking about is, of course, what is happening with Kim Jong-un, and we don't know. But we discussed how after this pandemic, how we can continue with our efforts. And I think this is a very, very important issue that the Swedish government put a lot of priority in. We also discussed, and then you can say, I can tell you a little bit about it, but Yemen, Belarus, the Middle East peace process, our initiatives on nuclear disarmament, and of course, Ukraine and Russia. So it was many issues. I can say a few words if there is anything of special interest.
Well, I might just draw out and ask you on Ukraine, if you can say a few words relative to what do you see as a potential next step in dealing with Ukraine. And maybe I'll also toss in back to North Korea. It sounds like you think that there might be some openings or possibilities post-coronavirus.
Yes, well, to start by finishing the North Korea discussion, the truth is we don't know, because even if our special representative have an invitation, you don't know the situation after the coronavirus. But we see no reason why it shouldn't be possible to continue to build on the positive atmosphere that actually took place in Stockholm. But our experience in Sweden with dealing with North Korea is that it's never a straight line. It's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and you have to have patience, you have to have sustainability, and it's too important to quit, I would say, in this issue. Then when it comes to Ukraine, we discussed both there has been several changes in the Ukrainian government, and also chief negotiator and so on. And it's very important that we keep the issue of international law, and that we don't recognize the so-called People's Republics Luhansk and Donetsk as being the partners of the conflict. We see the Minsk agreements as absolutely essential to follow. And it's also important, and we had at the last or latest EU ministers meeting, it was only 2 issues at our agenda. It was the corona and Ukraine. And before that, this was last week. And before that, we had a meeting with a group of countries who has worked especially with Ukraine, and the new foreign minister, Minister Kuleba, whom I also met in Kiev. In March, I just before everything broke out, I visited both Kiev and the contact line in the east of Ukraine. And a specific problem is that the pandemic is used as a pre-context for hinder the movement of the special mission, the OSCE special mission, who is to Russia, saying that this was unacceptable. But we got the protest sent back just with the wording, "We are not part in this conflict." And of course, this is not how we see it. And so we discussed our views on how to try to promote a solution in this case, where both United States and Germany and France and the OSCE, where we now are playing a much bigger role from the Swedish side, has to take a lot of political responsibility.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Minister, I wanted to ask one more question. And specifically, after the question, I want to go to some of the questions that have come in. We have a full range of questions that attendees in this virtual town hall meeting have posed. I wanted to ask you about the fact that Sweden launched the world's first feminist foreign policy. So in this coronavirus pandemic, how does that specific feature of Sweden's foreign policy, how do you see that featuring in this health crisis? And I don't mean only in your own country, but just across the globe.
Well, thank you. Actually, we had a meeting. We have a network of female foreign ministers. I think it was Madeleine Albright who started that once a long time ago, but we continue.
That's correct. And by the way, she's an Atlantic Council, very engaged with the Atlantic Council. Yes.
Okay, well, we continue in her footstep. And last week we had a video meeting with the Female Foreign Ministers Network. And we also worked out an article together, many of us, that it's now going to be published. And we started to work for a resolution on a view of gender, that you need to have a view when it comes to gender also on the pandemic. Yes, it's true that it's more men than women who die, but at the same time, you can see that there are 70% working in the healthcare sector are women. Many of them have unstable work. They don't have protective gear as they should have. Many have works that is precarious, and they are harder hit on the economic consequences than the men are. And also we can learn from previous crises that both financial crisis and Ebola crisis and others, that the domestic violence is growing when people are in lockdown or when people lose their jobs and so on. So there are several areas where you need to put on your gender glasses to see this pandemic, and especially the measures to fight the pandemic, is actually affecting women in a more negative way than they are affecting men. Of course, when I said this together with one of my former colleagues who now work in the UN Women, in a Swedish article, immediately they say, well, more men die than women. Yes, that's true, but it's not a contradiction that many women are harder hit than men when we are now fighting the virus, and that is what we have to look upon. And we want to all countries and governments to see this, so they can do something. In Sweden, for example, we took a decision to have $10 million extra to women shelters and to fight gender-based violence and domestic violence because of the corona.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Let me, if I may, go to some of the questions that have come in from our town hall. Here, I would like to ask, and by the way, I'm going to get Fred Kemp in a moment. Fred Kemp would like to also pose the question, and if Fred wouldn't mind, I'm going to go to one of our attendees in our town hall. This is from from Tracy Wilson. I'm going to Tracy Wilson first. She asks, what are the next steps for the Stockholm Initiative on nuclear disarmament that you have been leading? And given the delay in the 2020 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that was scheduled to begin this week in New York, could you say a few words about that? And then I want to try to go to Fred Kemp next. And then we have a question from Max Bergman.
Well, thank you very much for that very interesting question. The Stockholm Initiative was Sweden taking the initiative for 16 non-nuclear states to work especially for the non-proliferation treaty that was supposed to start 2 days ago, but it's now postponed for a year, I think, to have a stepping stone step-by-step strategy to try not to go with a big leap immediately, but to go article by article, to try to make it better and more effective in the non-proliferation treaty, to be able to get it back on the negotiation table, because we can see that several countries has again started to use nuclear weapon in their military strategies. And that is very worrisome. I am the foreign minister of Germany, Heiko Maas. We sent a letter last week to the nuclear states. And we also made a common video. You can see it on my, I think in English it's fan page on Facebook. It sounds a little pretentious in Swedish. We don't say it like that, but you can find our video on what we do when it comes to the nuclear disarmament, and that was published 2 days ago. And now we will try also to speak with the nuclear states, and that's why, of course, I mentioned this also to Secretary Pompeo, that for us, we are worried about what's going on. And that's why we think that this should be once again up on the agenda.
All right, great. Fred Kemp, let's go to you next.
Madam Minister, thank you for this absolutely fascinating discussion with Paula. It underscores again how valuable this period can be become, in one sense, is we would have waited for you to come to DC to talk to you, but this is so valuable to talk to you now. I wanted to talk to you about the deployment under your leadership of the Swedish government of troops, up to 150 troops to Mali, with the French-led forces there taking on militants tied to Al-Qaeda and to Islamic State in the Sahel. I wonder if you could talk about what prompted that decision and what will be the measure of your success.
Well, we have taken a responsibility together with many other countries when it comes to Mali. We think it's very important. It's the whole Sahel area now, the Sahel 5 countries. And we have proposed from the government that we should take part also in a French-led troop with special forces called the Takuba force in Mali, and the parliament will take decision if this is what Sweden should do, if they should follow the proposal of the government. I think that we have had so many talks in the parliament with the different parties, so I think there will be a majority in the parliament for this. So we will reason our efforts in Mali. Unfortunately, we see heightening risk of terrorism activities in the area. We see that they work across the borders, not only in Mali, but in some of the neighboring countries. And that is, so it's not only for the situation in the region, in the Sahel region, that we need to be there. It's also of European self-interest that terrorism should be fought wherever it is. We also see that we spend a lot of development cooperation money from Europe to this area, but it cannot be effective as long as there is so much fights, aggression, terrorist attacks. So it's also to be able to build up the society that we need to be there also military.
Thank you for that. Let's go to, I mentioned Max Bergman has a question. He basically asked that at last week's European Council meeting that Sweden took the position of not supporting the recommendation of strengthening the EU's economic response to this crisis, and in particular, increasing the EU Commission's budget. So the question was that given a strong and unified Europe is critical to the Transatlantic Alliance, isn't Sweden's frugal approach, is that undermining the EU and the Transatlantic Alliance?
No, it's absolutely not undermining the European Union or the transatlantic relation, which we think it's very, very important. But the thing is, how do we see the European Union doing economical things together and by the different states? And we do not agree that there should be unlimited grants to everybody by getting a high loan to EU, and by that putting the EU economy in jeopardy. We want to have strict order in the finances. We have it in our own economy. We have saved a lot in Sweden in our bonds. We have only 21% debt in our national budget when we went into this. And that meant that we could afford to have very, very big crisis packages to mitigate the economic consequences of the pandemic. And we don't think that EU is strengthening by taking each other's costs. But of course, you need to prioritize differently in the budget so that you don't use money for things that we cannot afford, but you use it to where it's needed in this time to mitigate consequences of the pandemic. We also think it's just natural that when one of the big countries, United Kingdom, has decided to leave the European Union, they also, of course, are not going to pay the membership fee. And our view is that then we have to reduce the activities accordingly. And some other countries think that the rest of us should pay for that loss of the British money. We are has always been to ourselves and also in EU of the view that you need to be very strict economically, because there is always crisis, there is always something you need to do, and if you don't have the economy in order, this will be difficult. So that's why we don't believe that EU should put themselves in, or ourselves in such a high depth that these proposals would lead to.
Madam Minister, if I may go back to a couple of comments or questions from our attendees regarding COVID-19. But I also want to, after I do that, I want to also go to Anna Wieslander because she's representing Atlantic Council in Sweden, and we'd like to take a question from her. I think she'd like to pose one. But we had a number of questions. I'm going to combine them from a number of attendees about the pandemic. One question not identified from the person, but they wanted to know if you had a view as to when you think the pandemic might be over. Another one was, if I may toss in, that do you think that this, from Laura Stentleben, if I forgive my pronunciation, she's asked the question whether the COVID-19 crisis will facilitate solidarity and cooperation within the European Union. Do you think that we might actually come out well in that regard, in terms of Europe or the international community, or are we more headed towards a nationalistic crisis management approaches? And let me add one last one from Philip Anstrom. He points out that when you gave your answer that you talked about, Sweden, what's happening with Sweden. And naturally, that was my question. But his question is, could you talk about it comparatively with that of the other Nordic countries when explaining why Sweden's approach is working? What about that dimension of the specific issue?
Yes, I will try to, or is it Anna first?
It's you.
It's 5 minutes ago. Reckon a few minutes, but I really had to go.
No, it's you, and then we'll take Anna's question, and if your time is short, we will wrap.
Okay, just quickly. Unfortunately, it's not possible to say when it's over. We wish, all of us, that we had a date. Everybody's wishing, but it's not possible. What we can see is that many of the countries are now have the steepest part of the curve behind them, and we are managed to flattening the curve, but the downward steep will take a long time. And my government has said that this is a marathon, it's not a sprinter. So I think that when you are planning your vacation, don't be sure that you could go abroad as possible, because I don't think that will be possible. Solidarity in the EU, well, I would say that first it was not very good, because everybody was just panicking, thinking of themselves, and did a lot of things that were harmful to the cooperation. But I would say rather quickly, common agreements, for example, when it comes to tenders and to buy things together and take away VAT for medical equipment and other issues worked. But how this will go in a more positive or negative way, that will be decided by how we all act afterward. Is it going to be a blame game, or is it going to be a way to see that everybody tried to do their very best and now try to heal as much as possible? And when it comes from the Nordic countries, I would say that we have every week we have video meetings with the foreign minister, but also the Nordic minister, the Nordic health ministers, and infrastructure ministers have had meetings. And when it comes to repatriation of citizens, we have had a fantastic cooperation. So even if we have different strategies, the cooperation is very close, and we do a lot of things together. And then we have decided, for different reasons, to carry it out a difference. But I'm sure that the Nordic cooperation will stand strong also after this crisis.
All right. Well, thank you for responding to all those. Anna, please. Anna Wieslander.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to raise a transatlantic issue, which also is important, and that's EU deepened defense cooperation, and to take more responsibility for its own security. And that has awoken some skepticism in the US, a worry that this will duplicate NATO capabilities, that it will close the market for defense industrial cooperation and so on. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit on Sweden's stance when it comes to deepened EU defense cooperation and balancing also the transatlantic link.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we believe that we should have both cooperation but also bilateral agreements. During this period when we have been in office, we have secured several very important bilateral defense agreements, including with the United States of America. And that is how we see our cooperation. We want to have close cooperation with NATO, for example. And we also hope that it should not be only defense ministers who are invited to NATO meetings, but also Minister of Foreign Affairs, which has not happened now for the third year, which I'm very disappointed of. But actually, a closer cooperation, the better it is. We want a deep cooperation on security and defense inside the EU, but we don't believe in an EU army. That's definitely a red line for Sweden. Thank you.
Minister, I was going to ask you one last question and we'll close. And I apologize, you got quite a few questions from this town hall meeting. Very simply, because it follows on a little bit in the defense lane. Ann Linde asked, will Sweden become a member of NATO? Will it ever become a member of NATO? And what conditions might have to be fulfilled if it does become a member of NATO?
I cannot see that we will become a member of NATO. There is no public majority for that. But I see that there is a big interest both from the government and the public to have very close relation with NATO, and that is the way that we work. So we have chosen to have a cooperation strategy with NATO, not member, but very close cooperation.
Minister Ann Linde, thank you so much for joining us in this town hall, virtual town hall. We're most appreciative of your time. We were delighted that you took a digital visit to the United States. And seriously, and just thank you for your openness, your directness. Sweden is an important partner to the United States, and we're just not only grateful for that, but also, if I may say, from the standpoint of the Atlantic Council, we also truly appreciate greatly the collaboration that we've had with your institutions, with your government, with your country. Just thank you again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you for all interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you.